The Golden Triangle Veterans Memorial Park, near the foot of the Veterans Memorial Bridge and Rainbow Bridge, contains 10,000 names of Golden Triangle servicemen and women who served in World War I and World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, peacetime, Desert Storm, and with Merchant Marines in World War II. This park also features a 50-foot Tower of Honor listing names of 930 of those killed or missing in action, in addition to statuary and military vehicles. Static displays include an F-4D Phantom jet, an M60A3 tank, a UH-1 Huey helicopter, an anchor from the Texaco 55 Mississippi, the last World War II merchant marine ship to be decommissioned, an assault landing craft, and an oversized bronze Marine soldier statue. The park is open dawn to dusk year-round. The history of the United States Army, America's first national institution. Since its official establishment, June 14, 1775, more than a year before the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Army has played a vital role in the growth and development of the American nation, drawing on both long-standing militia traditions and recently introduced professional standards. It won the new republic's independence in an arduous 8-year struggle against Great Britain. At times, the Army provided the lone symbol of nationhood around which patriots rallied. March 25, 1774, Boston Port Act. In the wake of the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament closed the port of Boston to ships with its passage of the Boston Port Act, which took effect June 1, 1774. It was the first of the coercive or intolerable acts, 5 laws passed by the British Parliament to suppress resistance to its authority over the American colonies. May 20, 1774. The second act, the Massachusetts Government Act of May 20, 1774, stripped the colony of its sovereignty. Many throughout the 13 colonies viewed this act as the most egregious of the intolerable acts, and feared the British might impose similar laws on each of the rest of the colonies. Tensions heightened when Lieutenant General Thomas Gage, the Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America and Royal Governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, invoked the new law in October 1774 and dissolved the Provincial Assembly. In response, colonists formed their own alternative government, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which controlled the entire colony outside of Boston, and prepared for a possible military confrontation with the forces that occupied the capital. April 19, 1775, Battles of Lexington and Concord. Upon learning that this extra-legal government was amassing stores of weapons in Concord, about 20 miles from Boston, Gage sent a military expedition, April 18, 1775, to seize and destroy all the munitions his men could find. This led to an exchange of musketry between local militia and British troops at the Village Green in Lexington and at the Old North Bridge in Concord, April 19, 1775, signaling the start of the American Revolution. Militia units and other volunteers from Massachusetts and other New England colonies quickly converged on Cambridge. They formed what became known as the New England Army of Observation and put the British forces posted at Boston under siege. For the time being, the rebellion was a regional affair. May 10, 1775, convening of the Second Continental Congress. Now that the fighting had begun, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress looked to the Continental Congress, which convened on May 10th in Philadelphia, for assistance from the other 12 colonies of British America. After much discussion, the delegates resolved to create an army that would represent not just New England, but all the British colonies on the continent of North America. June 14, 1775, establishment of the Continental Army. On June 14, 1775, the Continental Congress passed the following resolution, quote, resolved that 6 companies of expert riflemen be immediately raised in Pennsylvania, 2 in Maryland, and 2 in Virginia, that each company, as soon as completed, shall march and join the army near Boston, to be there employed as light infantry, under the command of the chief officer in that army. With that resolution, the Continental Congress adopted the New England Army of Observation, making it a Continental Army, a united colonial fighting force that could represent all 13 colonies with the addition of the troops from the 3 middle colonies. The Continental Army thus became America's first national institution. The birth of the United States Navy. Quote, "Let Americans disdain to be the instruments of European greatness. Let the 13 states, bound together in a strict and indissoluble union, concur in erecting one great American system, superior to the control of all transatlantic force or influence, and able to dictate the terms of the connection between the old and the new world." End quote. So ended Alexander Hamilton's essay on the crucial role a navy would play in safeguarding America's commerce and reputation. The essay also laid out all the hopes of the new nation: peace, prosperity, and respect from the mighty nations of Europe. Yet the Navy's creation and development proceeded piecemeal and haltingly in face of seemingly intractable political, ideological, and economic obstacles. It took a quarter century for the Navy to emerge as a stable institution, and although we now celebrate the birthday of the Navy on the 13th of October in 1775, it is but one of the several important steps on the way to a permanent naval defense force for the American people. The origins of the Navy actually predate independence by almost a year. On August 26, 1775, the Assembly of the Colony of Rhode Island sent its delegates to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia to request that, quote, "a fleet of sufficient force for the protection of these colonies," end quote, be established. Although the Congress had already urged individual colonies to mount their own naval defenses, the Rhode Island Assembly understood that securing American ports and waters would be a bigger job than one colony could handle. Philadelphia agreed on October 13, 1775, and created an advisory committee staffed by John Langdon of New Hampshire, Silas Deane of Connecticut, and John Adams of Massachusetts. Adams would become a lifelong champion of the Navy. In addition to protecting American trade from British blockade and predation, the committee also made recommendations for intercepting British ships laden with supplies for the King's forces in North America. Within hours, the Congress approved the committee's recommendation that Massachusetts supply General George Washington, then stationed in Massachusetts, with an armed schooner and a sloop for the purpose of seizing British supplies. At the same time, Connecticut and Rhode Island would arm merchant vessels to patrol the near North Atlantic for British transports. These small forays found immediate success. On the heels of these successes, the Continental Congress committed itself to naval expansion in 3 ways. First, the Congress authorized the purchase of 4 more ships of war. Second, it enlarged the Naval Committee to 7 men. And third, it extended the committee's brief of building up a naval force south of New England waters, all the way to Georgia, quote, "for the protection and defense of the United Colonies," end quote. As plans materialized, the Congress received some bad news from London, news that would push the delegates to commit even further to the establishment of the American Navy. On November 9, 1775, word arrived that George III of Great Britain had refused the Olive Branch Petition, the Congress's last-ditch effort to preserve peace with the mother country, and that the king had declared the colonies to be in a state of open rebellion. The Continental Congress now geared itself up for a protracted struggle on the seas. In the ensuing weeks, the Congress passed a series of resolutions to purchase more ships, to allocate funds of the Naval Committee, to call up American Marines, the country's first, to approve the set of rules and regulations modeled on those of the Royal Navy and penned by John Adams for this new American Navy, and to authorize the capture of all British vessels involved in the suppression of the colony's nascent revolt. Taken between October 13, 1775 and the end of that year, these actions served to establish the first American Navy. The history of the United States Marine Corps, as told on Marines.com. Since November 10, 1775, ours is a legacy of having each other's backs and never backing down. On legendary battlefields like Guadalcanal, Chosin Reservoir, and Marha in defense of our national interests. Through necessary actions back home, enabling our own struggling communities to thrive once more, then and now, every Marine is a United States Marine. fighting through every circumstance to continue our nation's advance. To be a Marine is to always move forward with tenacity towards the next battle standing in our way of our nation's progress. But Marines also have a long lineage of defining moments to look back on, serving as a source of immeasurable inspiration. November 10, 1775. The Corps is born. Captain Samuel Nicholas set up the first Marine Corps recruiting headquarters at Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, looking for, quote, a few good men, end quote. The few and the proud who make up today's ranks are comprised of men and women who have the resolve to fight and win for our nation's common cause. 1776. First Amphibious Raid, Fort Nassau. 5 companies of Marines carry out the Corps' first amphibious landing on foreign soil, successfully seizing stockpiles of British gunpowder and munitions. 1805. The Leathernecks arrive, Battle of Derna. The Marines rescued the kidnapped crew of the USS Philadelphia on the shores of Tripoli. They received the nickname Leatherneck due to the high collar they wore as protection against the sabers of pirates. 1918. The Ferocity of the Devil Dogs, Battle of Bellewood. Marine forces launch a last-ditch close combat assault against German soldiers and completely shred the defensive counterattack. Surviving German soldiers nicknamed their adversaries Devil Dogs due to their relentless fighting spirit. The birth of the United States Air Force. This brief history surveys the beginning of the United States Army's Air Arm and the birth of the Air Service in World War I. It traces the evolution of the Army's air combat branch between World War I and World War II and its tremendous organizational growth during World War II. Following the war came various changes to cope with the establishment of a separate armed service independent of the U.S. Army. On August 1, 1907, the U.S. Army Signal Corps established a small aeronautical division to take charge of all matters pertaining to military ballooning, air machines, and all kindred subjects. There were, at the time, few aeronautical subjects upon which to build. From the close of the Civil War until 1907, the Signal Corps had acquired only 8 balloons, though 2 more were procured in 1907. A year later, the Signal Corps purchased a small dirigible used at Fort Omaha, Nebraska, for the instruction of servicemen. But not until May 26, 1909, did Lieutenants Frank Lam and Benjamin Folloy make their first ascent and qualify as the airship's first Army pilots. The Signal Corps began testing its first airplane at Fort Myer, Virginia on August 20, 1908. And on September 9th, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, flying with Orville Wright, was killed when the plane crashed. Subsequently, after more testing with a second improved Wright Flyer, the Army formally accepted this airplane, identified it as Airplane Number 1 in August 2, 1909. 4 years after the Signal Corps took charge of air matters, Congress for the first time appropriated funds for Army aeronautics, $125,000 for fiscal year 1912. By the close of October 1912, the Signal Corps had acquired 11 aircraft but possessed only 9. Airport Number 1 had been given to the Smithsonian Institute, and 1 other had been demolished in an accident. A few months later, in early 1913, the Army ordered its aviators who were training in Augusta, Georgia, and Palm Beach, Florida, to Texas to take part in 2nd Division maneuvers. In Galveston on March 3rd, the Chief Signal Officer designated the assembled men and equipment the 1st Provisional Aero Squadron, with Captain Charles Chandler as squadron commander. The 1st Provisional Aero Squadron, organized at Galveston on March 5, 1913, began flying activities a few days later. On December 4th, General Orders redesignated the unit as the 1st Aero Squadron, effective December 8, 1913. This first military unit of the U.S. Army devoted exclusively to aviation, today designated the 1st Reconnaissance Squadron, had remained continuously active since its creation. Assigned a role in the punitive expedition of the Mexican border in 1916, this squadron became the first air combat unit of the U.S. Army. Early in 1941, the War Department instituted a series of actions to create a hierarchy of non-combat activities. It set up a command eventually designated Flying Training Command to direct new programs for training grounds crews and technicians. The next year, the new command assumed responsibility for pilot and aircrew training. In mid-1942, the War Department established the Air Corps Ferrying Command to fly aircraft overseas for delivery to the British and other allies. As the functions of the Ferrying Command expanded, it was redesignated as the Air Transport Command. To control supply and maintenance, the War Department established the Air Corps Maintenance Command under the Air Corps Materiel Division. The Materiel Division then concentrated on procurement and research development. A War Department reorganization on March 9, 1942, created three autonomous U.S. Army commands: Army Ground Forces, Services of Supply, and Army Air Forces. This reorganization dissolved the office of the Chief of the Air Corps and the Air Force Combat Command, and merged all elements of the air arm into the Army Air Forces. This administrative reorganization did not affect the status of the Air Corps as a combatant arm of the U.S. Army. All of these actions affecting the air forces and commands that comprise the AAF emphasized the surge towards an independent service and the expansion of combat forces that took place during World War II. Before 1939, the Army's air arm was a fledgling organization. By the end of the war, the Army Air Forces had become a major military organization comprised of many air forces, commands, divisions, wings, groups, and squadrons, plus an assortment of other organizations. Rapid demobilization of forces immediately after World War II, although sharply reducing the size of the Army Air Forces, left untouched the nucleus of the post-war United States Air Force. A War Department letter on March 21, 1946, created two new commands and redesignated an existing one. Continental Air Forces were redesignated Strategic Air Command, and the resources of what had been Continental Air Forces were divided among Strategic Air Command and the two newcomers, Air Defense Command and Tactical Air Command. These three commands and the older Air Transport Command represented respectively the strategic, tactical, defense, and airlift missions that provided the foundation for building the post-war independent Air Force. The history of the United States Coast Guard. The United States Coast Guard, one of the country's 5 armed services, is a unique agency of the federal government. We trace our history to August 4, 1790, when the first Congress authorized the construction of 10 vessels to enforce tariff and trade laws and to prevent smuggling. Known variously through the 19th and early 20th centuries as the Revenue Marine and the Revenue Cutter Service, we expanded in size and responsibilities as the nation grew. The service received its present name in 1915 under an act of Congress when the Revenue Cutter Service merged with the Life Saving Service. The nation then had a single maritime service dedicated to saving life at sea and enforcing the nation's maritime laws. The Coast Guard began to maintain the country's aids to maritime navigation, including operating the nation's lighthouses, when President Franklin Roosevelt ordered the transfer of the lighthouse service to the Coast Guard in 1939. In 1946, Congress permanently transferred the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation to the Coast Guard, thereby placing merchant marine licensing and merchant vessel safety under our purview. The Coast Guard took over the administration of bridges over navigable waterways in 1967. The Coast Guard is one of the oldest organizations of the federal government, and until the Navy Department was established in 1798, we served as the nation's only armed force afloat. We continue to protect the nation throughout our long history and have served proudly in our nation's conflicts. Our national defense responsibilities remain one of our most important functions even today. In times of peace, we operate as part of the Department of Homeland Security, serving as the nation's frontline agency for enforcing our laws at sea, protecting the marine environment and our vast coastline and ports, and saving life. In times of war, or at the direction of the President, we serve under the Navy Department. The Coast Guard History Program is charged with collecting, preserving, and promoting the history and heritage of the national government's oldest continuously serving sea service. The U.S. Coast Guard is simultaneously and at all times a military force and federal law enforcement agency dedicated to maritime safety, security, and stewardship missions. We save lives. We protect the environment. We defend the homeland. We enforce federal laws on the high seas, the nation's coastal waters, and its inland waterways. We are unique in the nation and the world. The Coast Guard's official history began on August 4, 1790, when President George Washington signed the Tariff Act that authorized the construction of 10 vessels to enforce federal tariff and trade laws and to prevent smuggling. Known variously through the 19th and early 20th centuries as the Revenue Cutters and the System of Cutters, the Revenue Marine, and finally the Revenue Cutter Service, it expanded in size and responsibilities as the nation grew. The service received its present name in 1915 under an act of Congress that merged the Revenue Cutter Service with the U.S. Life-Saving Service. The latter consisted of dozens of stations placed around the nation's coastline that were manned by dedicated crews willing to risk their lives to save those in peril on the sea, a role that meshed well with the Revenue Cutter Service's core missions. Also, the legislation created this new Coast Guard expressly stating that it shall constitute a part of the military forces of the United States, thereby codifying the service's long history of defending the country alongside the nation's other armed services. And from the very bottom of my heart, to everyone who has served, is currently serving, and who will serve America in the future, thank you so very much, and God bless you for your service and sacrifice for this, the greatest nation that this world has ever seen. Thank you, God bless you all, and God bless the United States of America.